It's JC at Motorcycle Superstore, and today we're going to go over how to change the rear tire on a dirt bike. Now this is a very intimidating task, but I can promise you it's not as hard as you probably think it is. We can do it with some very basic tools. I'm not going to have anything flashy in here, just the bare minimums on how to get by, and I promise you can do this in your own garage. So let's go over just some of these items that we're going to need for this project, and then we'll get right into it. These are the basic tools you're going to need. So first off, you have a valve core remover so you can get all the air out of your tube. You're going to need a wrench, typically a 12 or a 13 millimeter, so you can pull off your bead lock. You're also going to need at least 2 tire spoons. I actually prefer to use 3, but 2 is the minimum number. And then also you're going to have to check your air pressure when you're finished. It doesn't have to be this nice, but you can just use something to make sure you got the right PSI in there. Also, it's good to have some sort of a lubricant. I prefer Windex. It evaporates quickly and doesn't leave a residue, but you can't just use soapy water, simple green, whatever. So a shop rag's handy to clean everything up. Now that we got it figured out, let's go into a little more depth about the tire spoons, because that's the bread and butter. The tire spoons are what you're doing the most of the work with, and it's important that you get the right ones. My preferred tire spoon is this. It's a Motion Pro. It's very basic. It's about 10, 11 inches. You can find several brands besides Motion Pro, but let me tell you why I choose this style. It has everything to do with the shape of the spoon itself. What you want is something that's as wide and as flat as possible. A slight scoop is great. You're going to need that to get inside the rim, but when you're working towards the end of the bead and you got to slip this thing in, you don't want it to be fat. This is a very common style. You can see how thick that is compared to this style. So even though these are a little more affordable, I don't prefer them. Now, 10, 11, 12 inches seems to be pretty decent on getting the leverage. I also like something that has a smaller handle. For instance, here's one that has essentially the same end, right? But the handle is much larger. And if you're going to tuck this underneath your brake rotor or underneath your sprocket, it's nice to have these thin ones because they get in there a little easier depending on what bike you're working on. Sometimes these don't go underneath. So this is really handy. I did go through a phase where I went with the biggest and gnarliest thing I could find. This is from Zip Tire Racing and it's great. However, if you're just doing regular tubes, you really don't need something this large. This is for doing bib mooses, those foam inserts where you really need that leverage to crank them down. You don't have to worry about pinching the tube. So this is really a little bit of overkill for a standard tube. I recommend just something along this nature. It's simple, it's basic, and they're only about 15 bucks. First up, obviously, is to remove your wheel. Now, one of the things to think about when you're taking this thing off is your axle. You want to keep all of your components, the lock nut, everything in one place so that you don't lose it. If you're going to just throw it back in, go ahead and just set it aside, but if it's going to take you a while, then go ahead and put this stuff back together, put the nut on the end, that way everything's in one place. Now, you also want to pull your wheel spacers out as well, and it always serves me best to leave those wheel spacers on whichever side of the motorcycle they went on the wheel. That way you don't confuse them. Another thing to remember is that there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to make this job a lot easier. I'm actually not a big fan of them. I do all of my tire changes on the ground. I just throw it down on a piece of cardboard. I throw it down on a piece of cloth or something to protect the wheel a little bit, but basically you don't need all that fancy stuff. Obviously it can make things a little bit nicer for you, but it's not mandatory. So we're going to do it old school style here, and the first thing to do is get all the air out of the tube. So we're going to pop the valve cap off, and I also pull the lock nut off of that at the same time. Using our valve core remover, it's really easy just to pull this thing out and it will go totally flat. Another thing to do right off the bat is to use that wrench and get your lock or your bead lock loosened up, because you're going to need that to be free as well. Ratcheting wrenches are great for this. Obviously you don't have to have one. Something else that's real handy is a set of mechanics gloves. I usually wear just an old set of moto gloves and maybe cut one of the fingers off for a little better dexterity. Once that's loosened up, it's time to get the bead off, or the tire off the bead. So this tire actually had a hard time seating, so it's probably going to pop off really easy. If you can't do it by hand, you take a spoon and you just press down on it. Once that gets popped loose, you can simply just use your hands and it comes off very, very easily. Old tires are usually a pretty difficult one to work with, but it just takes a little bit of elbow grease. You're going to want to do it on both sides. And once you get that push loose, make sure you go ahead and free up your bead lock. So you want to push that down. This one came loose. One of the tricks you might use is take your tire iron and give it a tap. That'll help push it in as well, so you're able to get it nice and loose. Now don't take the nut all the way off the end. You're going to want to leave that there because you don't want the whole thing coming out. One of the things to think about when you're pushing the bead off of the rim is you actually want, the goal is to have the bead down inside the deepest part of the rim. This is called your rim well. And if you push the bead down into that, it allows you the room to then stretch it over the lip of the rim on other parts of the tire. So we'll start with 3 tire spoons like I mentioned. You can either do it at the rim lock or somewhere else. I actually prefer to start a little bit away from the rim lock. And like I said, 3 spoons makes it the easiest. Now as I pull this thing over, we want to push this down and make sure that it's down in the rim well. You want to look for that on both sides of the tire as well. So we push this one over, and you can see how it locks easily underneath of the brake rotor. So once you get that initial few done, then you start working your way around the rest of the tire. Sometimes it takes a little bit. You can let it off with one of the other tire spoons. Otherwise, you just work your way in. The first few are a little difficult, and then it gets a lot easier. Once you get one side off of the bead or off of the rim, then we're going to just flip it over, and we're going to use the over-over technique. So we'll go over on this side, we'll go over the other way. The rim will be totally inside the tire. It's a lot easier now that we've got one side off. And if you want to start at the rim lock, you can totally do that. It's a lot easier this time around. So once it's off of both sides, now you can see how the tire will fall down inside, or excuse me, how the rim falls down inside of the tire. And what that does is it allows this big space in here for us to be able to then push the tire off of the rim. As soon as the tire's off, it's time to do a little bit of inspecting. So you're going to want to take a look at your rim strip, which is the rubber piece. A lot of times, if that's damaged, you'll see that somebody has put tape in there. You can always use tape if you don't have a rubber strip. You're going to want to look, make sure that there's no nipples, no spoke nipples poking through, because that is what can give you a flat tire. Also, now is a good time to, if you're planning on maintaining your spokes, or if any of them are unnecessarily tight, now's a good time to actually shoot a little bit of WD-40 or something on the back side of the nipples to help keep those freed up when you do come time to change them. Also, you want to clean this thing out, make sure there's no debris in there, and you're going to inspect your bead lock as well. You can pull this thing out. You can see this one actually has some damage on it. If you see cuts and tears on them, it's always a good idea to replace them if you need to. They're fairly inexpensive. I'm going to stick this one back in. I think it's got a little life left in it, but keep that in mind. It's probably time for this to go fairly soon. All right, now we're going to get the new tire, and one of the things that I've been doing with this tire is I've been letting it warm up. So you should always put your tire outside in the sunlight before you start if you can, to help soften it up. At the very least, get it out of your garage and put it in your house. That way it's going to be at least at 70 degrees, and that's going to help that rubber be a little more pliable. You can always reuse your tube if it's still in good condition. You'd put your valve core back in, tighten it down, and put a little air in it. I went ahead and got a new tube for this one. I'm starting with a new tire, a new tube, just to keep it fresh. Anyways, it does help to put a little air in it, just enough so that you can kind of see the crease here. That's going to help it keep its shape, and it'll help prevent pinching once we start spooning it on. Now, you can either put the tire on and then try to stuff this thing inside. I've done it that way, or you can actually put the tube in first and then put it on the rim. That's how we're going to try it today. So now we're going to slide this thing in there. Some people use baby powder to help lubricate it. Some people use a full-blown rubber grease or a tire grease. I've never really used those myself personally very much. So I'm just going to throw this tube inside. If you want to go ahead and try those out on your own, go for it. All right, now, tires can be directional based on which model you're using. I've elected to go with the the Pirelli Scorpion MX Extra X tire. This is the one that offers the most longevity. You saw my old tire. I clearly like to get as much as I can out of them. So I'm going to use this one. It is not directional. We can just spoon it on whichever way we want to go. Now, this rubber is obviously a little bit sticky. This is where the lubrication comes in. I'm just going to give it a quick shot all the way around the bead. You can be very liberal with this stuff, and remember, you can always put more on if you need it. we'll do that. We'll get our valve stem roughly lined up with where it needs to be. So it's going to go on like this, and we're actually going to start at the rim lock. So we'll push the tire down and slide the rim lock inside of the bottom edge. Once we get it started in there with the bead lock, then we can actually push most of it on by hand. This is where that lubrication is coming into play. It's worth noting, I like to do this with the sprocket side down because we're going to work on this side, and once we start prying, we want to have that sprocket down so we're not hitting our knuckles against it. All right, we can just get our spoons in here. Now, it's always going to be easier to start several of these at once. So even if you just kind of have to lay them in there sloppy a little bit, it'll be easier than trying to squeeze them in once it tightens up. Kind of keep your knee on it to help force it down. You're kind of forcing both beads over the edge, which makes it hard. So you're going to want to make sure that that second bead doesn't actually go inside as you start working around. Now once we get here to the end, one last pop, and now our tire is one side on. Before we can put this other side on, we're going to have to get the valve stem out through the hole. So one of the easy ways to do that is to find the hole in the rim, and then we're going to pull the tire over the rim on the other side. So we'll flip it over, get our tire spoon here, and then pull this off the rim. So once it's tucked underneath, it'll hold it out. That's going to give us more space inside to work with. So the the tube is just floating around in there. We should be able to reach inside and guide that valve stem out through the rim. The valve stem is so close, it's almost poking out on its own. So what I do is I stand in the center of the tire on the hub itself, and then I can pull up, get my hand inside, and feed this thing through. Once we've got that through, we don't want it getting sucked back inside, so we'll go ahead and throw the nut on the outside to prevent that from going back in. Now that we've got the valve stem poking out, we release it from the other side slowly. We make sure that the tube isn't getting pinched by the tire itself. Now we can spoon the rest of it on. So let's lube it up. We get our Windex out again. Don't be bashful with this stuff. It all wipes off. We're going to start at the actual bead lock on this, and we're going to use 2 spoons, one on each side, and we're going to push that in with our fingers. So it's going to look like this. We'll get one started. Now when you push these spoons in, here's where we want that thin, wide profile. You barely get it over the lip just until you feel it pop in, and then you pull it back out so that it kind of snugs up to it. It's going to go in like this and then back out. And the last thing we want to do is get much past 90 degrees. If we can, we're going to keep our spoons here. Once you start doing that, that's when you start pinching tubes. All right, push it in. Got one on each side. And now we can continue spooning this on the rest of the way around the tire. Once we work our way a little bit away from the bead lock on each side, then it's going to start going on very easily. Now, you want to make sure that you can take pretty large bites to begin with, and by that I mean the distance between your spoons, because it's pretty easy to get the tire on. As we get farther and farther around the rim, it's going to become more difficult. We'll have to take smaller bites. So, we mentioned earlier about keeping the rim down inside the rim well, or excuse me, keeping the tire down in the rim well. So every once in a while, we want to push on this back end. We'll keep our knee on it to help force it down in that deeper area. Work our way around both sides. If it starts to dry out a little bit, give it another shot. You can never have too much lube, as they say. So as the pressure starts pushing around, you can see where my spoon came out. Just keep your knee on it, and you'll be able to move it out. This is one of the reasons why I like doing it on the ground instead of on a tire stand or up on a bench or something. I can get my knees on it, I can get my feet on it, I can hold things in place. Now when it gets down here to the end, This is where it's really tight. So before we get down to our final bites, I want to make sure I have all my spoons in there because it's going to be really difficult to slide them in here at the end. You see I'm taking small bites. I'm not throwing my spoons all the way over. And then once you get to here, you can typically just push the last little bit on there. Our tire's in place. Now we just have to fill it up with air and see if it actually is going to hold. It shouldn't take too much to get this thing to seat onto the bead. I can actually do it with an air pump system, or a compressor obviously is a better option. But let's put some air in it and see if this thing's going to hold. As you're filling this up, we're trying to get it back on the bead. So you're going to see this rim line or this bead line that pops out nice and proud. It's like 1/8 of an inch or so. But as you'll notice up here, mine doesn't want to get on the rim up here. And I've always had a problem with this rim doing this, so I have to pay special attention. Now if you pump a whole bunch of air into this, you can actually pop your tube by overinflating. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take the valve core out, deflate it, shoot a little bit more lube in there. We're going to make sure the tire's not between, or excuse me, the tube's not between the rim and the tire. Take a look at it, then we'll try pumping it up again. Usually if you do that, inflate it and deflate it a couple times, you can actually get this thing on there pretty easily. So we had to inflate it and deflate it a couple times just to make sure this thing was on, but now that it's there, we've inspected it. The bead is indeed seated all the way around on both sides. So we'll tighten down the rim lock while it still has a bunch of air pressure in it that's forcing the rim lock tight. I like to run mine pretty dang snug. I kind of just do it by hand, but you don't want to damage your rim, and at the same time, I'm a trail rider. I'm usually pretty far from the truck, so I kind of give it a little extra cinch to make sure that thing's not going to slip. Now, the tire is pretty good, but we have to set the tire pressure because I got a whole boatload in here. I usually run 11 or 12 in the rear and either 11 or 12 up front. So that's what I'm going to set it at. We'll put the tire or the wheel back on the motorcycle and we're done. Once the pressure's set, we're going to put the valve cap back on. But before we do that, you want to look at this lock nut. If you were to cinch this thing all the way down and then the rim did spin inside the tire, that's going to rip your valve stem straight out of the tube, and there's no way you can repair that on the trail. So once that's on there and we put our valve cap on top, then we'll back this thing out and use it as a lock nut so that our valve cap doesn't come off when we're on the trail. Another thing to think about as well, a little tip here, these are standard valve caps, but take a look around, maybe go to an auto parts store, you can find a valve cap like this. This one actually has the valve core remover on it, so you can see the difference, and this is actually going to act as a tool for you when you're having to make trailside repairs. So before I put this tire back on, I'm going to take my tire iron, I'm going to stick it in between my brake pads and just spread those apart. That's going to help my rotor get in there a lot easier. Also, some other things I'm going to do, obviously, is put the wheel spacers back in. We know which side they go on because we left them easily identifiable. Also, you're going to want to clean and re-grease your axle as well. So when this goes in, we're going to have a clean, smooth running axle. So now you know how to change a rear tire, and it really doesn't take a whole lot. The fronts are even easier. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm sure there's tons of different tips. You're going to see 1,000 different ways to change a rear tire. But this goes to show that with just a few basic tools, you probably have most of this stuff already. Buy a couple tire irons. They don't have to be expensive, and get down and do it. Yes, you can buy bead buddies, and you can buy rim protectors, and you can buy those monster tire irons and all that stuff. You can buy a tire changing stand. But this just goes to show, if you're willing to be a man about it, get your hands dirty, sweat a little bit, you can throw this thing on the ground and get it all done in just a matter of minutes once you get the hang of it. So you don't even need a compressor. I use this crappy bicycle tire pump to get this whole thing seated back on the bead. So go out there and give it a shot. Leave me some feedback on this video. Let me know your favorite tips of the trade, and good luck to you. Changing tires really isn't that difficult, and I saved you a lot of time and a lot of money down at the shop.